good to be back in southern New South Wales and working with FarmLink again. Yeah, really enjoyed my time here when I worked with Cyro out here a lot. So today I'm just going to give a bit of a description of some research I've sort of been, well, actually a lot of the ideas for this research actually came from or developed in southern New South Wales at Tallimba at the Ag Innovation Centre. And sort of been developed over the last 10 years, I guess with more emphasis on Victoria. And yeah, last year FarmLink did some experiments. So we got a little bit of local, well, 1 year of local data, which we'll show as well. So yeah, what we're trying to do with this research has been about how we can better manage our nitrogen fertiliser or even any source of nitrogen in our system, really, including from legumes, to make sure we're getting the best yields and profit we can for the amount of rainfall that we get. As I say, this sort of research has been going for a bit over a decade, and lots of people have been involved, and funding's come from various sources, for which I'm very grateful. So what I'm going to do is sort of briefly say why we might still care about nitrogen, because there obviously has been a lot of research and it seems like a simple thing. Then I guess talk about the way, maybe that we can change the way we think about nitrogen from being a very annual thing to maybe more of a systems thing. And nitrogen banks is a way of sort of making decisions about how you use fertiliser if you think of it more as a systems issue. I'll show you some proof of concept data that came from Victoria and a lower rainfall site, and then I'll show you the first year of the local southern New South Wales data. And I've told Hayden I've packed in too many slides here, so I'll rush through a few of them. But probably the first thing about why do we care about nitrogen still is that nationally across Australia, it is still the single biggest reason, nitrogen deficiency is still the biggest reason that we're not growing the yields we could for the water we get. Now that's not every paddock in every year. In fact, this part of the world might be one of the better performing regions because it has such a high proportion of mixed farming and legume pastures still in the system, but nationally it's the case, and I think it's probably the case in most regions. That's an interesting question. How many people here are mixed farmers still with legume pastures in the system? Almost everyone. Any continuous croppers? Jamie? Jamie's the only continuous cropper, and do you have grain legumes or just canola wheat, Jamie?
Just canola wheat at the moment.
Okay, righto. So this talk's probably more for Jamie than everyone else. I guess one thing, well, an easy way of telling whether nitrogen deficiency is an issue for you is how much low protein wheat you deliver. So if you're below 10.5% protein, you're almost certainly nitrogen limited, your yield was nitrogen limited, and even between 10.5 and 11.5, it was probably nitrogen limited, and once you're over 11.5, so into that H2 sort of category, then you're probably not nitrogen limited. And once you're into prime hard, you're actually probably starting to lose yield the other way from having too much in. So I guess, rough feel, say over the last 5 years, what proportion of, well, has anyone been delivering any ASW over the last 5 years? So there's a bit. I've got to try and work out well, someone tell me the sort of percentage, like yell out, what sort of ASW, APW split do you reckon you get? Anyone want to?
Might depend on the years, but we could be thrown out probably with the last couple of years with some potentially high yields, maybe James. So like saying that myself, I've probably been 4.5 or more probably for at least either over 5 years, but say 2021.
Yep.
I'll have to say 10.5.
Yep.
Like bad yields, that's what drove that.
What, like, Darryl, was that a similar story?
Exactly what James said.
Yeah.
2021 when it started raining, it was like last year.
Yep.
Yeah, definitely a lot more last year, but then there seemed to be more high protein associated with lung disease. Well, because of the
sort of other limitations other than water. If you think back to, I guess, a sort of more average rainfall year, is there any ASW or is it all H2 plus? Still get the occasional load? Yep. Well, there's no such thing as an average, I suppose, but like somewhere, if you think about, if you got your sort of, if you know what your long-term average yields are and you think to a year where you got close to that, what happens, I suppose, is the question. But I suppose the general feeling I get is that it's probably nitrogen deficiency is less of an issue here than it is in many other parts of the country where continuous cropping is more prevalent, but you're probably still having the occasional issue. So let's say that there's still some point in me giving this presentation and I won't just go home yet or just talk to Jamie. But I guess, well, in my mind, a big part of the issue with managing nitrogen in Australia is that nitrogen requirements based on potential yield, so how much yield your crop's going to actually produce, and Australian wheat is rain-fed, and Australia has the most variable production environment in the world by a really long way, and southern New South Wales is one of the most variable locations in Australia, so you can grow everything from 0 to 7 tonnes in a given year, and right here in this part of the world, that's probably one of the most extreme examples. And so when we're deciding how much nitrogen fertiliser to apply, we don't know what the yield's going to be, so we don't actually know how much nitrogen the crop's going to need, and we know that we've got negative consequences of over-application, so we can be worried about having a sunk cost that we're not going to recoup in a year of application, environmental losses, haying off, acidification, all those things. So I guess nationally and historically, inputs of nitrogen fertiliser have been lower than offtake in grain. So we've sort of had these negative nitrogen balances. And again, this part of the world's probably a bit different because of the legume pastures. You're getting the input of nitrogen from there and that maintenance of soil organic matter. But yeah, any sort of continuous cropping regions are running negative nitrogen balances. So this, if we sort of go back to, well, I had a lot to do with yield profit when it first started out and used to use it as a decision-making tool for nitrogen. But I sort of had my eyes open when I moved to Canberra and started working in southern New South Wales, and about how variable like the yield outlook was. So this is a run from 2010 from the water use efficiency side at Coleman's, which I worked with Jamie and others on, trying to work out how much nitrogen to add. And even in what was a really good start to the year, so had a good early break and lots of stored water, like the range of outcomes went from 3 up to over 9 tonnes per hectare in July when we were trying to make a decision about how much nitrogen fertiliser to add to the crop. And it's a dead straight line, so any of those outcomes is equally possible. So how do you manage that? Like what number do you pick as to how much fertiliser you're going to add to get up to that target? And that's probably could quite possibly be what we're looking at this year. We've got some good plant available water from the wet year last year, but we've still got the variability to deal with. Okay, so how to manage that variability was sort of in my mind as to how you could make a better decision about fertiliser. And I started thinking about this a bit more when I went on a trip with CSIRO to visit the Chinese Academy of Sciences in the North China Plain, which is one of the most productive regions agriculturally anywhere in the world. So they double crop maize and wheat year in, year out. So summer maize, winter wheat. And they, as you can sort of see by the look of this maize crop, they put on shitloads of nitrogen, like 500 kilos of nitrogen, so over a tonne per hectare of urea every year, because it's really heavily subsidised, because it stopped the population starving to death in the 1960s. And once you had 25 million people starved in the 1950s, that sort of focuses your mind on good agronomy and growing food. So yeah, nitrogen fertiliser is still subsidised, growers use heaps of it, and they've got no yield gap. Like they get every bit of yield they could for the rain and the irrigation water they apply. So the Chinese hosts were very hospitable. They gave us lots of banquets. They gave us lots of booze and cigarettes. I don't smoke and I can't really drink, so by 10:57 p.m. on one of the first nights we were there, I was charming and hilarious and proposing a toast to our hosts and thinking about how we could do some research together. Things got much worse by midnight, and the next day I had an awful hangover as we went into our meeting to decide what our sort of common interests might be. But I kind of had an idea that came from a very damaged brain, was that China had this really little yield gap because they just put on shitloads of fertiliser, huge amounts of urea. And they've got awful problems. They lose heaps of it to the environment because it's irrigated, so water means nitrogen loss. A lot of nitrogen pollution going into the waterways, but they actually increased their soil organic carbon because they've been putting on so much nitrogen and a lot of residue back to the soil. They acidified their soil. It started off reasonably alkaline, whereas Australia was quite a contrast. We're applying nitrogen fertiliser at market price, not subsidised, applying less than we probably should, so less than's coming off in the grain. We lose little to the environment because we're pretty dry. We're dry land, and yeah, we sort of have wet winters, largely down in the south, but pretty dry summers. So we have very low nitrogen pollution at the moment. We're actually mining our soil organic carbon in a lot of environments, and this doesn't apply to you, I'm sorry, I should have taken that out. But in some environments we're aggressively alkaline. Obviously that's not the case around here. So is there a sort of happy medium between these two extremes? And Victor Sadras, who's a scientist from SARDI in South Australia, sort of talks about water use efficiency and nitrogen use efficiency trading off. So if you've got heaps of nitrogen, you'll have very high water use efficiency, whereas if you've got lots of water and not very much nitrogen, you have very good nitrogen use efficiency but low water use efficiency. And the thinking was that nitrogen fertiliser is expensive, but water is priceless usually. Let's ignore last year. So why don't we just try and get as much out of our water as we can? And what happens if we just push that to the extreme, a little towards the China example, and just always make sure there's enough nitrogen to get the yields that are mostly on offer. So sort of thinking about the way nitrogen works in our systems and in the soil, sort of an analogy that I like to think about is it's kind of like the two-chamber squeezy bottle. So most of our nitrogen sits down here in organic form, which is stored in soil organic matter. So it's in there with carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus and sulphur and everything else. But so there's tons per hectare of nitrogen sitting in the organic form down here. And what we want to do for our crops to use it, it has to turn into the mineral form. So it gets squeezed up into the little chamber through mineralisation, and then it drops back out through immobilisation. And this is where our crops use it and take it off, and it's also where we get our losses from. And this is where, when we add synthetic fertiliser, that's going into our mineral pool straight away. And if we're using legumes and manures, then that's coming into the organic form. But if we think of these as our inputs and outputs, what you can see is if you don't have a lot of pastures, Jamie, then your only input into the system that's going to maintain this organic supply as well as the mineral supply is synthetic nitrogen fertiliser if you're in a continuous cropping system. And so if you want to keep your organic matter, you need to make sure there's as much going in as there's going out. And even in graze systems with legumes, you still need to make sure that the total balance over time is positive. So your legumes plus your fertiliser is matching what the crop's taking out. And then if we sort of think about what happens to fertiliser when it goes into the soil, like our crops, generally speaking, only get about 30% of what you apply in the season that you apply it from fertiliser, and the rest comes from the soil, from this, the mineral form, either what's sitting there in mineral form or what mineralises out of the organic bank. So having a a fertile soil that can provide that 70%, that bulk, is really important agronomically. But at the same time, when you apply fertiliser, only about half of it gets taken up by the crop. So about a third of it goes out in grain, about 11% thereabouts goes into the stubble, and the rest, and some gets lost in the environment, and the rest stays in the soil. So maintaining that fertility, a big part of that is the fertiliser that isn't used that you apply. So actually applying fertiliser and having it not taken up by the crop is important particularly in our continuous cropping systems. So yeah, the idea we sort of wanted to test was, well, what happens if you just apply more fertiliser than your crop really needs? Do we lose it all, or does it carry over? And are we sort of helping to build our fertility? So we set up an experiment at the TAIC, 2013 and 14, where we applied what we thought was too much N. It was only about, I think it was just over 100 kilos of nitrogen at the time, which seemed excessive back then, but probably is not so bad these days. And we measured, we had 15 N tracer and we had flux towers to measure any losses. And what we found was that we hardly lost any. So we recovered most of the 15 N over both those years. And they were, I hesitate to say average, but they were, I guess, more typical than the last couple of years we had. They did get wet in winter. So we're getting most of our fertiliser back. We're not losing it. So sort of based on that, there's not really a lot of downside of over-applying fertiliser. This is the next sort of person that influenced the kind of thinking about nitrogen banks, and it's my mum. And mum was charged with making the nitrogen decisions on our family farm. So the fact that Dad wouldn't have anything to do with it suggests that it was a bit of a difficult decision anyway, and he was outsourcing it. And Mum would really struggle with making a decision about nitrogen fertiliser because of the reasons that we've said. And she was an avid yield profit user, so she'd do all the yield profit runs, but it sort of wouldn't help make a decision because you still had all those probabilities, and you sort of had to pick, well, am I going to yield 5 tonnes or am I going to yield 0 tonnes? What am I fertilising for? And Mum would sort of agonise for weeks about what to do about it, and yeah, found it hard to make a decision. But another sort of person who influenced this is Derek Ingold from Durness here, and sort of talking to him about how he makes his nitrogen decision. He said, oh, well, I just sort of wait till late in stem elongation, and then I just chuck it out anyway, because I'm not going to blow it up, like at that stage of the season. And if it stays wet, the crop will use it, and it'll be happy days. And if it stays dry, it'll still be there for next year. And I won't have lost anything. I went, oh, well, that's a good way of thinking about it. Like, can we sort of test that? And so that's, I guess that's what we did. We sort of came up with this term nitrogen banks, which is really sort of the way Derek made his nitrogen decision. So if nitrogen carries over, why don't we just make sure there's enough to meet crop supply and crop demand in the majority of seasons, and not get too hung up about whether the crop takes it up or not, because if it doesn't take it up, it's going to carry over and it's going to maintain that fertility. We call that nitrogen banks. And then to sort of formalise it a bit more than Derek articulated it, we sort of thought, well, what happens if we have a target, like a base target of fertility that we always try and fertilise up to, and we just do that every year regardless. And so what we do is we measure our soil mineral nitrogen in autumn with deep cores, and if it's below that target, then we top up with fertiliser. So say if we had a target of 150 kilograms per hectare, which is about right for the Southern Mallee in Victoria, and we measure 70 kilos of mineral N, then we just top up to that 150, and we do that year in and year out, regardless sort of what happens. Maybe if you've got an extremely wet year, you might want to go a bit more gung-ho. If you had a very dry year, you might back off, but largely you stick to that process and you repeat it. So obviously there's a lot of things that could possibly go wrong with that system, but I've been waffling a bit, so I'm going to just move through. But we wanted to sort of test this as a concept, so we had a little bit of pilot research in the Mallee in Victoria at a place called Currio, where we've been having an experiment running now for 5 years, where we're sort of contrasting this sort of nitrogen bank way of decision making with other systems like yield profit that sort of try and manage the climate variability. So it's much lower annual rainfall than here, but probably not dissimilar in terms of potential yield or average yields moving west from here. We've run the experiment for 5 years in a district that would typically apply only about 20 to 30 kilos per hectare event. So these are the treatments that we had, and these are similar to the treatments that have gone into the New South Wales experiments. So we've got controls where we're not applying any nitrogen fertiliser at all. We've got one where we're replacing the grain nitrogen offtake with fertiliser, and one which is the national average. Then we've got our nitrogen banks looking at different target amounts. So that's the base level of fertility that we're going to fertilise up to each year. And then we've got either yield profit or yield profit light, where we're targeting different levels of probability. So if you remember that yield profit graph, that really big slope that went from 3 tonnes up to 7 tonnes at Temora, we're picking different points on that graph and fertilising up to that. We're measuring our mineral N in autumn down to a metre, and then we're top dressing in August. So yeah, that's how we're using yield profit. The yields just aren't as spectacular in Currio as they are at Temora. So I'm just going to give you a quick summary of what we found over the last 5 years, because I'm sort of cognizant of the fact that the southern New South Wales experiments have been only running for 1 year, and these are the sort of experiments where you need them to run for many years before you can sort of draw a conclusion. And so what the Currio experiment has shown is that all these systems are very effective at closing the yield gap. So this is the percentage of water limited yield that these different treatments achieve. And in fact, how you apply the nitrogen, whether you're using yield profit and trying to manage seasonal variability, or using the nitrogen bank system, which are these NB numbers, didn't really matter. It all came down to the long-term rate over the 5 years. And if you look at economic yields, they're sort of where you need to be most profitable. The sort of 2 treatments that really just get over that are this nitrogen bank 125 and the yield profit 50%. So fertilising for a median season finish. If we look at the dollars side of things, it's similar deal. So how you actually apply it doesn't change that much. It's largely driven by rate. So the optimal rates are up here about double at what the district rates were. But there's a pretty flat top to the curve. So you can be having quite a big spread in how much fertiliser you apply and still be equally profitable over that 5 years. One thing to note is that nitrogen banks usually aren't as profitable in really wet years like last year, because they're applying less nitrogen fertiliser. So there's our sort of optimal nitrogen bank for that environment down here, whereas our yield profit, which is trying to manage that climate variability and gets more aggressive in wet years, applies a lot more nitrogen, and in this case was more profitable. Let's skip that one. The thing to note is that a lot of the fears with the nitrogen bank system sort of haven't played out over the wetter years, because it's actually applying less nitrogen than yield profit at 50%, because yield profit's been saying go hard in the wet years. So this is the amount of nitrogen fertiliser that's being applied either in the nitrogen bank system or or yield profit. And you can see that yield profit gets what it thinks is a dry year, it applies very little, and then in a wet year it applies a lot, whereas the nitrogen bank's just plugging away at a steady rate. And so yield profit's actually getting a lot more nitrate. In terms of their nitrogen balance, which is really key to maintaining that soil organic matter and keeping your soil organic carbon high, the most profitable treatments have a small neutral to positive balance, and I think that's really key and something to think about in this part of the world. Even though you've got more legume pastures, like, are you putting as much in from the pastures and the fertiliser as you're taking out in the crop? Because that seems to be very closely associated with profit, and plus all the modelling studies we've done as well as that sort of sustainability. So that's what we found in Victoria. But FarmLink got support from GRDC to have a look at this more closely locally. So 4 sites, the Temora and the Harden site were managed by FarmLink. This was managed by River Plains and this by Central West. Very similar treatments, but this one down here added, which has only biological nitrogen. So vetch brown manure, followed by wheat. Is it brown manure, Hayden, or is it brown manure? Yep. So just, purely biological. And we also have a yield profit with the Bureau of Met forecast. So taking the decile that the Bureau of Met thinks it's going to be. So these were the yield profit runs for last year when we were making this decision, and sort of the background paddock levels. Obviously with such a wet start, all really gung-ho sort of yield forecasts. They've varied quite a bit in their soil organic carbon and starting mineral end. Temora was quite low in starting mineral end. Harden had a fair bit more. And we sort of estimated the nitrogen bank targets based on annual rainfall. And you'll notice, just pay attention to where yield profit thinks the lowest yields should be without any further nitrogen, which is what this green line is. Sorry, this is a bit small, but that's 2 tonnes per hectare there, and that's 6 and 4 there. So what actually happened, as yield profit indicated, so it's saying Temora should be really nitrogen responsive, and it was visually. These are photos that Hayden sent me during the seasons. That's the control, obviously quite nitrogen deficient, versus the treatment where 208 kilos of N was applied. But that sort of didn't really get reflected in the yields. There was a nitrogen response, so this is grain yield versus the fertiliser applied, so we've got everything from 0 up to 250 kilos of N, so over 500 kilos of urea, and yields went up, but not very much, not spectacularly. Normally you sort of expect to have a sort of quadratic or like an asymptotic relationship where you sort of come up like this, more like a curve, but it was sort of linear, which is a bit weird and might have been to do with the sort of season we had last year. And protein was the same. Just sort of linearly increased from levels where you think yield would be nitrogen deficient to more. And so what that meant from a profitability point of view was that given how expensive urea was last year, I fitted a straight line here, but probably it's more sort of like this. Putting a little bit of nitrogen on was good, but putting a lot sent you out the door backwards, because it was all GP as well, it all failed on test weight, so there was no premium for the protein that you got. If we go to Harden, likewise nitrogen responsive, but much more soil mineral N. So the amounts applied were a lot less, and you can see there's visual difference in the crop at heading. And it sort of gave a more typical response, but look how much it's growing without any nitrogen at all. 6.5 tonnes of grain with no nitrogen, which is much more than what yield profit thinks it could. So you're getting a lot more mineralisation than yield profit thinks is happening. And then these very high rates of nitrogen increased yield further, and also increased protein up to the levels where you wouldn't be thinking that yield was nitrogen limited. And that gave more of a typical response to gross margin as well. So sort of this increasing optimum and then tipping over the edge of too much nitrogen. While ago we don't have any photos. Apparently the contractors were locked out of the site for many months of the year, so it's a bit of a mystery site. And one of the mysterious things about it was that there was a negative response to applied nitrogen in an extremely wet year. So I'm wondering if there was an interaction with disease. It was vixen, which is very susceptible to stripe rust, so I wonder if there was something going on there. And yeah, proteins were reasonably high and increased a little bit with applied N, but not very much. And obviously, if you're spending money to lose yield, then you're going out backwards, similar to the Temora site. So FarmLink soil sampled these at harvest to see how much of the nitrogen that was applied was still there. And the bad news is that Hardin and Temora is that at harvest, some of those treatments, so this treatment here got close to 250 kilograms per hectare of nitrogen, and it wasn't there at harvest, which is concerning that it might have been lost to denitrification in the wet spring. And that contrasts to where there was the vetch, where you still had quite reasonable amounts of mineral N. Now I was speaking to a few people about this and they say, oh, that happens sometimes, but then it remineralises, and when you sample again at sowing, or just before sowing, you get differences between these treatments. So where there's a lot of nitrogen applied, you get more nitrogen again. So we'll see if that's going to happen, because it's going to be sampled before sowing, but I think the message from this is it's never been more important to soil test than this year, because you're going to have some really low paddocks, I think, and possibly some really high ones. Yeah, and that's just a photo Hayden sent of the vetch doing its thing and fixing nitrogen. Okay, so some take-home messages. It doesn't really sort of matter what decision you make with regard to nitrogen. The main thing seems to be from the Curry experiment that you're applying enough over the long term, and to know whether you're applying enough, you sort of need to know whether you've got that neutral to positive nitrogen balance. So you're not carting off more than you're putting in, and therefore you're not running down your soil organic carbon, your soil organic nitrogen. First year of New South Wales experiments showed some pretty variable responses in what was a pretty, there's no such thing as an average year, but last year was an extraordinary year. So yeah, the real value of these experiments is going to be over the long term, and I think they're going to continue for the next 4 or 5 years in the risk initiative. So probably the immediate thing is make sure you soil test in 2023, so you can at least make a rational decision about how much nitrogen to apply, and yeah, think long term about your inputs versus outputs. And that's me done. Hayden?